There is a kind of silence that almost no human being has ever truly known. Not the quiet of a sleeping city, not the stillness of a forest before dawn. Something deeper, vast, absolute, the silence of space. Those who have touched it say it does not just surround you, it enters you. It rewrites something inside your mind, your soul, your understanding of existence itself. And in April 2026, 4 human beings stepped into that silence, traveling farther from Earth than anyone had gone in more than 50 years. But there is something most people never heard about that journey, something small, almost invisible, yet powerful enough to change how we see the entire mission. Inside the Orion spacecraft, hidden among personal items, one astronaut carried something with him. Not a device, not an experiment, a Bible. And that man was Victor Glover, a pilot, an engineer, a man trained by science, and a man shaped by faith. Just days before launch, standing before cameras, before journalists, before the world, he did something unexpected. He did not speak about conquest, achievement, or history. He asked for prayer, calmly, without drama, as if what he was about to face required more than training, more than preparation, more than human strength. He spoke about another mission, the one their families would carry on Earth, the mission of waiting, the mission of trusting. And in that moment, something subtle but powerful shifted, because this was no longer just a flight. This was something deeper, a journey into the unknown, where technology alone would not be enough. Because where they were going, more than 250,000 miles from everything familiar, there are no guarantees, no safety nets, only distance and silence. And in that silence, Glover chose to bring something eternal, not as a symbol, not for show, but as something living, something he would need. Faith, not as an idea, but as strength. Faith to face what cannot be predicted. Faith to stand before something so vast it defies understanding. Faith not to lose yourself when everything you've ever known becomes a distant point of light. And what no one could yet imagine was that from that silence, words would emerge that would echo across the entire world. The Artemis II crew, Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Cook, and Jeremy Hansen, spent years preparing for this mission. Years of training, simulations, discipline, everything calculated, everything controlled. But there is one thing no training can prepare you for. The moment you see Earth from that distance. A small, fragile sphere suspended in endless darkness. Everything humanity has ever built, every story, every war, every dream, contained within that single glowing point. Astronauts have tried for decades to describe what that moment does to you, and almost all of them arrive at the same place. It breaks something open inside. For a brief moment, it feels as if you are seeing reality from outside of it, as if you are looking through a perspective that does not belong to you. Something higher, something beyond, and it changes you forever. The crew of Artemis II felt it too. Something awakened within them, something that had always been there, waiting for that exact moment, that exact view. But to understand what happened next, you need to remember something. This was not the first time space and faith crossed paths. In 1968, during the mission of Apollo 8, astronauts orbited the moon for the first time in history. And on Christmas Eve, from deep space, they read the opening words of Genesis to millions of people listening on Earth. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Those words, spoken from beyond our world, moved entire nations to tears. Humanity, standing on the edge of the unknown, chose to look not forward, but upward. And then, just a year later, during the Apollo 11 mission, before Neil Armstrong took that first historic step, another moment unfolded quietly, almost secretly. Buzz Aldrin paused, took bread, took wine, and in silence, alone, he took communion. No cameras, no audience, just a man and his faith on the surface of another world. NASA had asked him not to speak openly about it. But what happens in silence cannot be controlled. The first act performed on the moon was not a scientific experiment. It was an act of faith. Years later, more Bibles would travel to the moon, carried not as relics, but as reminders. And one astronaut, James Irwin, after walking on that surface, returned to Earth a changed man. He left NASA and dedicated the rest of his life to something completely different. He said something that stayed with people ever since, that God is not only present on Earth, but even there, on the moon. And now, decades later, Artemis II was not repeating those moments. It was continuing them. But this time, something was different. This time, nothing was scripted, nothing was planned. What happened came directly from within. During their journey, the crew captured images that will remain in history. Earth rising slowly above the lunar horizon, a blue light emerging from darkness, a reminder of how small and how precious everything we know truly is. They saw an eclipse from a perspective almost no human has ever witnessed. They looked upon the far side of the moon, a place no one on Earth ever sees directly. But the most important thing was not what they saw. It was what it did to them. Because at one point during the mission, something unexpected happened. The crew asked for time to speak, not because it was scheduled, not because it was required, but because something inside them could no longer remain silent. And the day they chose was not random. It was Easter Sunday, a day that represents resurrection, hope, life overcoming death. And from the depths of space, far beyond Earth, they chose that moment to speak. No script, no instructions, just human voices, responding to something they were experiencing at the deepest level. Victor Glover took the microphone, and what followed did not sound like a prepared statement. It sounded like something that had been waiting to be said. He spoke about perspective, about seeing Earth not as countries, not as divisions, but as one whole, one complete reality. No borders, no separation, just one home. And he admitted something rare. He had not planned those words. They came from what he felt in that moment, as if standing before creation itself had unlocked something that could not stay hidden. He spoke about beauty, not technological achievement, not mission success, but beauty, the beauty of creation. And there is something deeply human about that choice. Surrounded by the most advanced technology ever built, witnessing one of the most complex missions in history, and yet what moved him most was something simple, something ancient, wonder. pure, unfiltered awe. As if in that moment, everything unnecessary fell away, and only what truly matters remained. And then he said something even more powerful, something that, from that distance, carried a completely different weight. He spoke about a message given thousands of years ago. Love God and love your neighbor. From Earth, those words can feel familiar, almost routine. But from space, when you see the entire planet as one, they become something else entirely. Because from that distance, there are no nations, no conflicts, no divisions, just humanity. One shared existence, one fragile home. And suddenly, those words are no longer abstract. They become urgent, necessary, real. A reminder that everything we fight over disappears when seen from far enough away, and what remains is what truly defines us. And as the spacecraft moved closer to the moon, Glover described something that changed how he saw everything. He spoke of Earth as a vessel, not just a planet, but something designed, a system so precise, so perfectly balanced, that even the smallest change would make life impossible. The atmosphere protecting everything within it, water sustaining every form of life, cycles repeating with exact precision. And from the outside, it did not look random. It looked intentional, as if every detail had been thought through, as if everything had been prepared, long before humanity ever existed. And seeing it from that perspective did something irreversible. It removed the illusion of chaos. It replaced it with something else. Meaning, design, purpose. And in that moment, floating between Earth and the unknown, surrounded by silence that no one on Earth can truly imagine, a man looked at everything humanity has ever known and understood it differently. Not as something accidental, but as something given, something protected, something deeply personal. And then came the moment that no simulation could ever recreate. The moment where even the most advanced technology falls silent. As the Orion spacecraft moved behind the far side of the moon, something absolute happened. Every signal vanished. Every connection to Earth disappeared. No voices, no guidance, no confirmation. For approximately 45 minutes, those four human beings became the most isolated individuals in all of history. No one could hear them. No one could reach them. It was just them, the thin walls of the spacecraft, and a silence so complete it almost feels alive. And right before that silence swallowed them, Victor Glover spoke his final words back to Earth. Not data, not coordinates, not system checks. Something far simpler, far more human. He said that they could feel the love of those on Earth. And then, nothing. Silence. Total and unbroken. What happened during those 45 minutes was never broadcast. There were no recordings sent back in real time. But later, Glover shared something so quiet, so personal, that it almost feels like it belongs to a different dimension of the mission. He said that during that time, he prayed. Not a long speech, not something rehearsed, just a simple prayer. Think about that for a moment.
At the exact point where human communication ends, something else begins. Where distance reaches its absolute limit, something crosses it effortlessly. No signal delay, no interference, no silence, just connection. And that raises a question that lingers long after the mission itself. What happens to a human being when every external voice disappears? When there is no noise, no distraction, no input from the world?
What remains? For Glover, the answer was immediate. Prayer. As if, when everything else falls away, what is most essential finally has space to speak. And this is where the story becomes something more than a mission. Because what unfolded during Artemis II was not just a continuation of history, it was a reflection of something that has always followed humanity into the unknown. Across decades, across missions, across generations, the same pattern emerges. When we reach the edge of what we understand, we begin to ask deeper questions. Not about how things work, but why they exist at all. Scientists have a name for the transformation astronauts experience when they see Earth from space. They call it the overview effect. A cognitive shift, a psychological response, a change in perception. But that explanation, as precise as it sounds, only describes the surface. Because what many of those astronauts describe goes beyond perception. It touches something deeper, something older, something that feels less like a reaction and more like a recognition. As if the human soul, when confronted with the vastness of creation, remembers something it had always known. And what makes this even more striking is that the thoughts expressed during this mission were not new. They were not invented in that moment. They echo words written thousands of years ago, long before spacecraft, long before telescopes, long before humanity could even imagine leaving the ground. Ancient voices looked up at the sky and saw something that still holds true today, that creation itself speaks, that the universe is not silent, but full of meaning. One of those voices described the heavens as declaring something, not through sound, but through existence itself. And thousands of years later, a man floating in space looked out at that same reality and came to the same conclusion. Not because he was told to, not because he was trained to, but because, at that scale, the truth becomes difficult to ignore. There is something about seeing Earth from that distance that reshapes every question you have ever asked. Because suddenly, everything becomes smaller and more significant at the same time. Human life, fragile and brief, and yet somehow deeply valued. That paradox sits at the center of the experience. Why does something so vast contain something so personal? Why does a universe so immense seem to hold space for individual lives? And this is where the words spoken during the mission reached their most powerful point. Because after everything they had seen, after everything they had felt, Victor Glover said something that cut through all complexity. He said that we need Jesus. Not as an abstract idea, not as a cultural reference, but as something necessary, something essential. And consider where those words came from. Not from a place of comfort, not from a familiar environment, but from orbit near the moon, after witnessing creation from a perspective almost no human has ever experienced. Surrounded by silence, confronted with the scale of existence. And from that place, that conclusion emerged. It was not forced, it was not argued, it was simply stated, as if it had become obvious. And that simplicity is what makes it powerful. Because in a moment where everything could have been said, only one thing needed to be said. And that statement connects to something even deeper. The idea that the world we live in is not random, that it carries intention, that it was made with purpose, not just as a place to exist, but as a place prepared, sustained, held together by systems so precise that their balance feels almost impossible. And yet, here we are, living within it, often unaware of how delicate it all truly is. From space, that illusion disappears. You see the thin layer of atmosphere. You see the boundaries of the system that protects life. You see how everything depends on everything else. And suddenly the idea that this is all accidental becomes harder to accept. Because from that vantage point, it does not look accidental. It looks designed, carefully, intentionally. And that realization leads to something else: responsibility. Because if something is given, it can also be lost. If something is designed, it can also be damaged. And if humanity shares one home, then what we do within it matters more than we often realize. That is why the message spoken from space did not stop at observation. It moved into something practical, something immediate. Love one another, not as an ideal, not as a suggestion, but as a necessity. Because from far enough away, every division disappears, and what remains is simple: one world, one humanity, one shared existence. And yet the story does not end in space, because the most important part of this message is not where it was spoken, but where it is heard. You do not need to travel beyond Earth to experience what those astronauts experienced. You do not need to see the planet from orbit to ask the same questions. Those questions exist here, in everyday life, in quiet moments, in the spaces between noise and distraction. The same realization is available without leaving the ground, because the sky above you is the same sky they looked into. The creation around you carries the same imprint, and the silence they encountered can also be found in smaller ways when everything else is set aside. And that leads to something personal, because if what they experienced is true, then it is not distant. It is not reserved for a select few. It is something that reaches into ordinary life, into your life, into the moments you are living right now. The idea that you are not alone, that existence is not empty, that there is meaning even when it is not immediately visible. And that invitation remains open, not as a command, not as pressure, but as a possibility. To look at the world differently, to recognize something deeper within it, to respond to that recognition in your own way. Because at the end of everything, beyond technology, beyond achievement, beyond distance, what remains is something simple: a human being standing before something greater than themselves and choosing how to respond. The Artemis II mission will be remembered as a milestone in exploration, a step forward in science, a moment in history. But for those who look deeper,
It was something else, a reminder that no matter how far we go, no matter how much we discover, we are still searching for the same answers, and sometimes those answers do not come through data or calculation. They come in silence, in reflection, in the quiet realization that perhaps what we have been searching for has been with us all along, waiting, not in the distance, but within reach.